China's most valuable brands. Now this is thoughtful. Hello, I'm Trevor Lai in Shanghai. China is now one of the world's largest economies, so it's easy to forget that it's still an emerging market in many ways. Most private companies were started after 1990, and even the more established state-run enterprises are new when it comes to marketing. Both are competing with global brands, which are often older and well-funded by multinationals. We'll examine the challenges facing local marketers as they build new brands, and our own PT Black will take a look at a few Chinese brands ready to go global. But first, we'll speak with Rupert Hoogewerf, Chairman and Chief Researcher of the Huron Report, which just published the list of the top 100 most valuable brands in China. Rupert, what's the most valuable brand in China?
The most valuable brand in China is ICBC now. It's just taken over from China Mobile, who's been top of our list for the last 5 years or so. And so it's quite a big day for ICBC.
And Huron publishes this report every year. Who are some of the biggest winners and losers compared to 2010?
Well, I mean, if you look at the sectors that have been doing really well, and on the top 100 most valuable Chinese brands, it's been real estate or property. It's now number one. So I think it makes up 26% of the top 100, followed by financial services. And then you've got apparel or clothes. They've been doing really well. And IT services come up. And then there's sort of little made in China specialities, things like cigarettes and baijiu and beer. And they've done very well. But I mean, the ones that are on the up are IT is clearly on the up, and the ones on the down is clothes, because they're still growing, they're just not able to keep up with everybody else.
And were there any big surprises this year?
Well, the big surprise from my point of view was when we saw the IT companies come shooting up. And the top IT companies, actually, most of them are privately held as well. And the top IT company is Baidu, and we valued their brand as 50% of their market cap, so that's about $20 billion US as the value of the brand. And that made it this year more valuable than the Bank of China brand. And the Bank of China brand, obviously it's a much bigger company, but Bank of China, we valued the brand at only 15% of their total market cap, which has also ended up being around $20 billion US, but just a little less than Baidu. So Baidu is now broken into the top 5 most valuable brands in China today, and that's a phenomenal achievement. But when you talk to the sales staff on the street, and you're trying to work out, well, look, what does the brand actually mean for Baidu? Can you sell something else? Can you sell another search engine? The answer is it's very difficult nowadays, because the end users are all getting more and more used to Baidu, so you might even have another search engine breaking into the market, which so-called has better services, but because of habit, they're not going to want to change.
That's a very interesting comparison, because you've got a huge institution in the financial sector, and then you've got this high-tech upstart. Yet their market cap, a huge percentage of it, as you've calculated it, is based on their brand. What does that actually mean when you're saying the brand represents that percentage of its value, or that dollar amount?
I mean, this is a critical point, but it basically means that if you've got a choice, and you will choose this product rather than that product, and for every 100 kwai that you spend, 50 kwai of that will go into the brand.
Who are some of the brands that you've seen and been really impressed with in terms of how they've built their brand over the years in a very systematic or perhaps even exponential way?
A brand I'd say that's really impressed me has got to be Tencent. And they've not only got a huge user base, but they've actually built an element of loyalty, which means that for anybody else to break into that market, and it's going to be very, very difficult to, because they've just got such a massive user base behind them.
So what are some of the other big challenges that Chinese brands face when they're trying to build their brands, and perhaps they haven't hit the top 100 yet, but maybe they're down and trying to climb their way up?
Well, one of the things that strikes me is that if you're trying to explain to somebody outside of China who these brands are, I don't think anybody's heard of any of them. I think you'd be challenged to find an Englishman in England who's heard of more than 2 of those brands. Perhaps Qingdao beer, because in their Chinese restaurant in England they serve Qingdao beer. Perhaps they've heard of Haier, because it's been in the financial press as being very big somewhere in the world, but it's not in the streets in London yet. And Lenovo, you might argue they've got an element of global, they've got a global appeal. But again, not everybody would know them. You've heard of Dell, but not that many people know Lenovo necessarily.
Thanks, Rupert.
That's right.
And here's PT Black with a thought or two about Chinese brands that have global potential.
When was the last time you bought a Chinese brand, not counting made in China? Or better yet, how many Chinese brands can you name? Don't be surprised if you can't think of many. Interbrand's 2010 100 Best Brands in the World list doesn't have a single Chinese brand on it. The fact is, China's domestic market does a terrible job of preparing brands for the outside world. With the possible exception of telecom giant Huawei, almost all of the brands from China working overseas are selling based on value and are at very early stage of brand building. That being said, there are a couple of brands worth watching. The first is China's largest domestic beverage maker, Wahaha Group. Wahaha is known for its fearless innovation. It doesn't always work. Beer-flavored tea, anyone? But they have some big successes, like Express, a combination of juice and milk. Wahaha's appetite for experimentation could make it a formidable player in developing markets. The second brand is one that is already available in the global market, but has a lot of potential to develop farther. That's Midea, a white goods company. Midea is known for three things. First, design. Second, innovation. Third, it has a relentless focus on energy efficiency. What's more, as a privately owned company, Midea has flexibility its state-owned competitors lack. The third brand is Meters Bonway. That's the Gap of China, complete with sub-brands and celebrity-heavy marketing. Meters Bonway is known for taking bold action, but also for its unusual willingness to incorporate international perspectives into senior decision-making. And that ultimately is the biggest challenge Chinese brands face. In order to go global, you have to be able to think globally, both externally and internally. For companies in China, that means looking at operations, management, human resources, company culture, and even operating language. And really, once you've made all those changes, aren't you just another global company anyway?
Thanks, PT. With me now is Elan Shou, China Managing Director and Senior Vice President at Reuter-Finn, Tim Schlick, Head of Planning at DDB Greater China, and Jonathan Chajet, Interbrand's Executive Strategy Director for Asia Pacific. Tim, local companies are still learning how to become national brands. Are they ready to go overseas? And if so, how are they getting ready?
It's an answer you probably hate, but it depends. Some Chinese companies have been making fantastic progress if you take a look at Li-Ning or Haier or Air China. But it depends highly on first the category they're in. So are they fighting an uphill battle because of the category they are in? Or, and secondly, how long have they been doing this? And some companies have done pretty good so far, but I see a couple of years going back down.
Right. And Jonathan, which brands do you think, other than Li-Ning, have the best bet and the best chance to go overseas?
Well, I think we should be careful not to introduce our own biases into the question. I think the truth is there are many Chinese brands who are already very successful overseas. They're just not the sexiest brands in the world. They're B2B brands, right? So companies like Huawei, or companies like Sany, which is the Caterpillar of China, Mindray, which is sort of medical devices. I mean, very phenomenally successful overseas, driving more than 50% of the revenues now. So I think that there are already lots of companies. I think if you want to look at more sort of consumer brands, I think the brands that you're going to probably see go overseas in the future most successfully are automotive brands, because they'll be able to change the value equation in the dynamics, and similar to the way electronics companies from Japan or Korea did it many years ago. They were able to bring in products at a lower price, but of good enough quality, and they were sufficiently different in price that consumers can say, well, wait a minute, I'll take a chance. I'll have a closer look at this.
Elan, Chinese enterprises are often run by ambitious people, but are they really willing to take risks and experiment with hiring foreign talent or multinational agencies?
I really think they won't. They really want to do that. That's why you see a lot of international agencies are serving local clients.
But do they know how to work with them yet, or do they still treat them like local
That's
agencies?
actually my question. Are they ready for it? If you are asking me, are they willing to do that? Yes, they want. But are they ready for it? I don't think most of them are.
And so then how do agencies help their clients become ready?
Agency has to understand this, and agency has to take your time and to grow the client together with you. If we given some Korean companies like Samsung as an example in the past, that's a client a lot of agency hated to work with. It's just because it's so painful to work with them. But now they've become a pillar client for a lot of agencies. So you have to understand how to grow together with your client, and you have to understand that takes time and patience.
So can you think of any concrete examples of Chinese brands that are showing true innovation, not just relative to the market in China, but true marketing innovation?
I would say there are not that many examples. I think I mentioned Jawa before, has launched some herbal-based luxury shampoos in Paris, and I think that's quite unique. Shangsha is a new luxury brand that's part of Hermes, but has really been kind of nurtured on its own, and has really got some innovative ideas about what true luxury means in a Chinese context.
Do you see different behavior between private enterprises and state-owned enterprises when it comes to brand building?
Private company usually move faster and focus a lot on cost saving. To me, that's the major difference between private companies and wholly owned government companies. But in terms of the budget, or in terms of the willingness to go abroad, I think actually the wholly owned Chinese company are more willing to go abroad, because I think that's also the government initiative. We want Chinese companies to go overseas.
I think one of the things that the private companies get better than the state-owned companies when thinking about going overseas is they're actually less blinded by the glitz of the first world, first tier kind of European American markets, and they're more willing to say, I'm going to overseas in Sri Lanka or in West Africa or in some places where they know that consumers are already predisposed. And I think that makes a lot of sense. I think that's just good business sense, which is, do I go after 300 million middle-class consumers in Europe and in America, or do I have to go after 3 billion consumers in China, India, and Africa that are already dying to buy my products? And I think that's just makes much more business sense.
So can you think of any examples of Chinese brands that have gone overseas and perhaps failed, and that's really kind of served as a warning sign for some of these other private enterprises who, as you said, perhaps are not as tempted by the first world attraction?
Well, I think that you saw a few years ago some high-profile acquisitions like TCL buying Thomson's television business, the Lenovo acquisition, which both of those are really perceived as having been miserable failures in every sense, financially, organizationally. And I think what you saw was about when the last 5-year plan was being developed, a lot of the state-owned companies were going to the government saying, we need your help, we need your financing from the state-owned banks to go overseas. And the government said, we understand, but you need to first prove your ability to manage these acquisitions before we provide sort of the heavy-duty financing.
So that leads us to, in one word, what is the biggest obstacle that a local company faces in building a global brand? To each of you. Tim.
Time. I think building brands needs a lot of time, and the speed, you can't do that at the speed of China. You really have to take your time and consider what markets are important to you.
Elan?
I would say understanding, because the culture is so different, market is so different. They need to really understand what's the difference and be prepared for it.
And Jonathan?
I would say flexibility. I mean, I agree about time and education, but I think flexibility to be able to adapt to overseas markets. And it's funny because I think Chinese companies are the best in the world at being flexible and adapting in their home market, but overseas they need to learn those skills.
Jonathan, Tim, Elan, thanks for joining us on Thoughtful China. That wraps it up for today. Be sure to subscribe to us on Tudo and YouTube. You can also follow us on Weibo and Twitter. See you again.